There exists within the human psyche a pattern so seductive, so perfectly disguised as virtue, that it can consume an entire lifetime while the person remains completely convinced they are engaged in the highest form of service to humanity. This is not the occasional impulse to help someone in genuine need, nor the natural compassion that moves us to ease others' suffering when we are able. This is something far more insidious and psychologically complex: the compulsive need to heal, fix, and save others as a sophisticated defense against the terrifying prospect of turning inward to face our own unhealed wounds, our own unmet needs, our own unlived life. If you find yourself consistently drawn to broken people, if your relationships revolve around your role as healer and rescuer, if you feel most valuable when others need you most desperately, then you may be using others' pain as a drug to avoid your own. Jung understood what the compulsive healer cannot bear to acknowledge: that their endless focus on others' problems is not evidence of their evolved consciousness, but proof of their unconscious avoidance. Not demonstration of their spiritual advancement, but revelation of their psychological stagnation. The person addicted to healing others has discovered the perfect escape from the inner work that would actually lead to wholeness. They can stay perpetually busy with others' dysfunction, while their own remains carefully hidden beneath the noble mask of service. This pattern operates through what I call healing as hiding, the unconscious use of others' therapeutic process as a way of avoiding your own. The compulsive healer becomes an expert on trauma, addiction, codependency, narcissism, and every other form of psychological dysfunction except their own. They can diagnose others' problems with stunning accuracy while remaining blind to their own patterns. They become professional healers who never heal, perpetual helpers who never help themselves, expert diagnosticians who never turn their insight inward. The savior complex creates what Jung would recognize as projection as protection, the unconscious tendency to locate in others what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The compulsive healer projects their own need for healing onto others and then attempts to heal these projected aspects through proxy work. They see in others' addiction their own unacknowledged dependencies. They recognize in others' trauma their own unprocessed wounds. They identify in others' dysfunction their own unintegrated shadows, but instead of reclaiming these projections and doing their own work, they use others as screens for healing themselves indirectly. Perhaps most insidiously, this pattern creates what I call therapeutic narcissism, the unconscious belief that you possess special powers to heal others, unique insights into what people need, almost magical abilities to love others back to wholeness. This grandiose fantasy masks profound feelings of powerlessness over your own life, inadequacy in your own development, and helplessness in the face of your own wounds. The compulsive healer feels godlike in their ability to transform others while feeling childlike in their capacity to manage their own existence. The addiction manifests through what Jung called the wounded healer syndrome, the unconscious organization of identity around being the one who understands pain, who can handle crisis, who specializes in dysfunction. This identity becomes so central to the person's sense of self that they unconsciously seek out wounded people to maintain their role, create crisis to justify their intervention, and enable dysfunction to preserve their function as healer. They need others to remain somewhat broken because fully healed people do not require their services. This pattern also operates through emotional vampirism disguised as healing. The compulsive healer feeds off others' gratitude, improvement, and dependency as sources of their own psychological nourishment. They need others to thank them for their help, to credit them with their progress, to depend on them for continued growth. Their helping becomes a form of control that ensures continued supply of validation while avoiding the vulnerability of their own healing process. Perhaps most tragically, the savior complex prevents the very thing it claims to facilitate: genuine healing. The compulsive healer cannot truly help others heal because they are using others' healing process to avoid their own. They cannot guide others to wholeness because they have not achieved wholeness themselves. They cannot love others back to health because they have not learned to love themselves. Their helping becomes a sophisticated form of enabling that keeps both parties trapped in familiar dynamics of dependency and dysfunction. The most devastating aspect of this pattern is how it corrupts authentic compassion into manipulative control. What begins as genuine desire to help others gradually transforms into a sophisticated system for maintaining psychological superiority while avoiding personal vulnerability. The compulsive healer learns to give in ways that create dependency rather than empowerment, to care in ways that control rather than liberate, to love in ways that bind rather than free both themselves and those they claim to serve. Beneath the noble facade of wanting to heal others lies a complex psychological economy that Jung would have recognized as one of the most sophisticated shadow operations the human psyche can devise. The emotional marketplace where the compulsive healer becomes both merchant and customer, trading their healing services for psychological supplies they cannot generate internally. This shadow economy operates on a currency system where care is exchanged for control, healing is bartered for importance, and service is traded for the avoidance of self-confrontation. The compulsive healer has become an emotional capitalist, building an empire based on others' brokenness, while convincing themselves they are engaged in charitable work. This shadow economy functions through what I call wound investment, the unconscious tendency to invest time, energy, and resources in people whose problems provide the highest return on emotional investment. The compulsive healer gravitates toward individuals who are damaged enough to need constant help, but functional enough to provide gratitude, admiration, and dependency. They become psychological stockbrokers, carefully selecting clients who will yield the maximum psychological dividends in terms of feeling needed, important, and superior. The healer develops what Jung might have called a portfolio of the broken, a carefully curated collection of wounded souls who serve different functions in their psychological economy. There's the tragic figure whose pain makes the healer feel strong by comparison. The hopeless case whose improvement would prove the healer's special powers. The grateful dependent whose constant need validates the healer's importance. The dramatic crisis creator whose chaos keeps the healer feeling essential and engaged. Each relationship serves a specific function in maintaining the healer's psychological economy while avoiding their own inner work. This economy operates through therapeutic exploitation, the unconscious use of others' healing process to meet the healer's unacknowledged needs for power, control, importance, and meaning. The compulsive healer positions themselves as indispensable to others' recovery while remaining dispensable to their own growth. They become experts at reading others' wounds while remaining illiterate about their own. They develop sophisticated understanding of healing processes that they apply to everyone except themselves. Perhaps most insidiously, this shadow economy creates what I call healing as hoarding. The compulsive healer accumulates healing knowledge, techniques, and insights like a miser hoards gold, but never spends any of it on their own development. They become wealthy in understanding others' psychology while remaining bankrupt in self-knowledge. They collect degrees, certifications, and training in healing modalities, while their own inner wounds remain untouched and unaddressed. The economy also operates through crisis cultivation, the unconscious encouragement or amplification of others' problems, because crisis creates the emotional intensity and urgent need that feeds the healer's addiction. They may not create problems directly, but they certainly don't discourage their development. They become what Jung might have called chaos farmers, growing fields of others' dysfunction that they can then harvest for their own psychological nourishment. The shadow economics extend to what I call improvement ambivalence. The compulsive healer's unconscious resistance to others' complete healing because fully healed people no longer need their services. They sabotage others' progress through subtle undermining, create new problems to replace solved ones, or gradually escalate their own neediness to maintain the dynamic where they are needed. Their investment in others' brokenness conflicts with their stated goal of helping others heal. This economic system also employs gratitude manipulation. The healer learns to give in ways that create psychological debt rather than psychological freedom. They help in ways that hook rather than heal, support in ways that enslave rather than empower, care in ways that create obligation rather than liberation. They become loan sharks of emotional labor, offering assistance at interest rates that can never be fully repaid, ensuring continued dependency and ongoing supply of validation. The most devastating aspect of this shadow economy is how it creates mutual enabling systems. Relationships where both parties collaborate in avoiding their own growth while maintaining the illusion of healing work. The healer gets to feel important and avoid their own wounds, while the patient gets to remain irresponsible for their own healing while receiving constant attention and care. Both parties become addicted to a dynamic that prevents authentic development while providing the comfortable familiarity of familiar dysfunction. Perhaps most tragically, this shadow economy corrupts the sacred act of healing into a profane transaction where others' pain becomes the healer's gain, others' wounds become the healer's worth, others' brokenness becomes the healer's business. The compulsive healer becomes what Jung might have called a psychological vulture, feeding off the carcasses of others' dysfunction while convincing themselves they are providing nourishment rather than taking it. To understand why certain individuals become compulsively drawn to healing others as a way of avoiding themselves, we must excavate the childhood soil where these patterns first took root, where Jung recognized that the seeds of the helper addiction are planted in the tender ground of early trauma, family dysfunction, and the child's desperate attempts to survive in environments where their own needs were either dangerous to express or impossible to meet. The adult who cannot stop trying to heal others is not displaying evolved consciousness but carrying forward survival strategies learned in circumstances where helping others was literally a matter of psychological or even physical survival. The most common origin lies in what I call parentification trauma. Children who were forced to become caregivers for their own parents, family systems, or siblings before they were developmentally ready for such responsibility. These children learned that their value lay not in being children, but in being little adults, not in receiving care, but in providing it, not in having needs, but in meeting others' needs. They discovered that the only way to feel safe, loved, or valued was to become indispensable through their caring, creating a psychological template where worth equals usefulness and love equals service. Perhaps even more damaging is what Jung would recognize as emotional labor slavery. Children who became the family's emotional regulation system, responsible for managing everyone else's feelings, moods, and psychological states. These children learned to read emotional atmospheres with predatory precision, to sacrifice their own emotional needs for the sake of family stability, to become human shock absorbers for everyone else's dysfunction. They developed what amounts to an addiction to being needed, because being needed was the only context in which they felt safe and valuable. The helper addiction also stems from invisible child syndrome. Children whose own needs, feelings, and desires were consistently overlooked or dismissed in favor of more dramatic family members who demanded constant attention. These children learned that the only way to be seen was to be useful. The only way to matter was to serve others. The only way to exist was to disappear into the service of those who were louder, needier, or more demanding of care. They became background figures in their own lives, supporting characters in everyone else's drama, Another common origin is what I call crisis addiction inheritance. Children who grew up in families where chaos, drama, and emergency were the normal emotional climate. These children learned to equate love with crisis, care with catastrophe, intimacy with intensity. They became addicted to the adrenaline of emergency, the importance that comes with being needed during crisis, the sense of purpose that emerges from being the one who can handle dysfunction. Normal, stable relationships feel boring and meaningless because they lack the familiar intensity of dysfunction. The pattern also develops through conditional love programming. Children who learned that affection, attention, and acceptance were contingent on their performance as helpers, their success in meeting others' needs, their ability to sacrifice their own desires for others' comfort. These children internalized the message that they were only lovable when they were useful, only valuable when they were serving others, only worthy when they were self-sacrificing. This programming creates adults who cannot conceive of being loved for who they are rather than what they do. Jung also recognized savior fantasy formation as a common childhood origin. Children who coped with their own powerlessness and trauma by developing grandiose fantasies about their ability to heal, save, and transform others. These fantasies provided psychological protection from the reality of their own vulnerability and helplessness, creating an internal narrative where they were not victims but heroes, not wounded but healers, not needy but needed. This fantasy becomes a psychological addiction that follows them into adulthood. The helper addiction often stems from trauma bonding with dysfunction. Children who learn to associate love with a certain amount of chaos, care with some degree of crisis, relationship with rescue dynamics. They became bonded to the familiar patterns of dysfunction because that's where they experienced the closest thing to love they ever knew. As adults, they unconsciously seek out broken people because brokenness feels like home, dysfunction feels like family, crisis feels like connection. Perhaps most tragically, the pattern develops through self-abandonment conditioning. Children who learned that their own needs, feelings, and desires were not just unimportant, but actively dangerous to express. They discovered that advocating for themselves led to punishment, rejection, or increased family chaos. They learned to disappear into service to others as a way of avoiding the terror of being fully present as themselves, developing what amounts to an allergy to self-focus and an addiction to other focus. These childhood origins create what Jung called arrested development, adults who remain psychologically stuck in childhood survival strategies, unable to develop the healthy narcissism that would allow them to focus on their own growth, healing, and development. They remain perpetual children masquerading as wise healers, using others' brokenness to avoid confronting their own unfinished childhood business, their own unmet needs, their own unlived life that waits patiently for their attention to finally turn inward toward the healing that only they can provide for themselves. What makes the compulsive healing pattern so devastatingly effective as a defense against self-confrontation is how perfectly it provides all the psychological benefits of genuine growth and healing without requiring any of the actual work, risk, or vulnerability that real development demands. The compulsive healer has discovered the ultimate psychological comfort zone. They can feel important, wise, evolved, and spiritually advanced while remaining safely focused on everyone else's problems, never having to face the terrifying prospect of turning their healing attention toward the only person they can actually heal, themselves. This pattern operates through what I call vicarious growth, the addictive experience of feeling evolved through others' healing rather than pursuing their own development. The compulsive healer gets to experience all the satisfaction of transformation, the pride of breakthrough, the joy of progress, but none of it requires them to risk their own comfort, challenge their own defenses, or confront their own shadows. They live their healing journey through others, becoming psychological tourists who visit the territory of growth without actually moving through it themselves. The seductive comfort manifests through what Jung would recognize as intellectual spirituality. The compulsive healer becomes an expert on healing modalities, psychological theories, spiritual practices, and therapeutic techniques, accumulating vast knowledge about transformation without ever submitting to the humbling process of their own transformation. They can speak fluently about shadow work without facing their own shadow, teach about trauma healing without processing their own trauma, guide others through spiritual awakening without undergoing their own dark night of the soul. Perhaps most seductively, this pattern provides what I call superiority through service. The compulsive healer gets to feel morally, spiritually, and psychologically superior to others while maintaining the humble appearance of selfless service. They position themselves as the helper rather than the helped, the teacher rather than the student, the healer rather than the wounded, creating a psychological hierarchy where they remain safely above the mess of human dysfunction while appearing to serve those beneath them. The comfort also comes from what Jung called projection as protection. The compulsive healer can observe, diagnose, and work with all their own psychological material through others without ever having to own it as their own. They see their addiction patterns in others and help them recover while never acknowledging their own addictions. They recognize trauma responses in others and guide them through healing, while their own trauma remains carefully untouched. They identify dysfunction in others and assist them in change, while their own patterns remain safely projected onto external screens. This pattern provides controlled vulnerability. The compulsive healer can experience emotional intimacy, psychological depth, and spiritual connection through their helping relationships without the full risk and exposure that genuine intimacy requires. They get to know others' deepest wounds while keeping their own hidden, to witness others' most vulnerable moments while remaining safely behind their helper persona, to touch the sacred territory of healing while never fully entering it themselves. The seductive comfort also operates through what I call postponed authenticity. The compulsive healer can delay indefinitely the terrifying prospect of being real, being seen, being vulnerable by staying perpetually busy with others' healing. They use others' need for their help as justification for never having to risk being unhelpful, others' dependence on their strength as excuse for never having to reveal their weakness, others' requirement for their wisdom as reason for never having to admit their confusion or ignorance. Perhaps most insidiously, this pattern provides meaning through martyrdom. The compulsive healer finds purpose, significance, and identity through their sacrifice for others rather than having to create meaning through their own authentic self-expression. They become addicted to the noble suffering of endless giving, the righteous exhaustion of constant service, the virtuous depletion that comes from always putting others first. This martyrdom feels meaningful while actually being meaningless because it serves the ego's need to feel special rather than the soul's call to become real. The ultimate seductive comfort is what Jung recognized as the avoidance of individuation. The compulsive healer can remain safely merged with others' psychological material rather than undergoing the painful separation that authentic selfhood requires. They can stay psychologically fused with others' healing journeys rather than embarking on the lonely, uncertain, dangerous path of becoming who they actually are beneath their helper identity. They avoid the terror of psychological birth by remaining safely in the womb of others' needs, others' pain, others' journey toward wholeness, while their own journey remains perpetually postponed. We arrive now at the most crucial threshold in the journey away from compulsive healing, the recognition that the very thing you have been running from through your endless focus on others is the only thing that can set you free. The terrifying, necessary, sacred encounter with your own unhealed wounds, your own unmet needs, your own unlived life that has been waiting patiently in the shadows while you exhausted yourself trying to heal everyone else. This transformation requires what Jung called the sacrifice of the persona, the willingness to let die the identity that has provided meaning, purpose, and protection in order to discover who you are when you are not needed, who you become when you are not helping, what remains when you stop being the solution to everyone else's problems. The sacred turn inward begins with what I call withdrawal of the healing projections, the conscious recognition that everything you have been trying to heal in others actually exists within yourself, that every wound you have diagnosed belongs to you, that every dysfunction you have treated is your own shadow material projected onto convenient screens. This withdrawal is not intellectual but visceral, not theoretical but experiential, requiring you to feel in your own body the addiction you've been treating in others, to acknowledge in your own psyche the trauma you've been healing elsewhere, to own in your own heart the brokenness you've been fixing in everyone else. This process demands what Jung understood as radical responsibility, accepting that you cannot heal anyone else, that you have no power over others' growth or development, that your endless efforts to fix others have actually been elaborate avoidance mechanisms that prevented both you and them from doing the real work that healing requires. This responsibility is not self-attack, but self-empowerment, not shame, but liberation from the impossible burden of trying to control others' journeys while neglecting your own. The transformation requires what I call comfortable uselessness, learning to exist in relationships without constantly proving your value through helping, to be present without providing solutions, to connect without being needed. This involves developing tolerance for the anxiety that arises when you are not actively fixing, solving, or rescuing, learning to find peace in simply being rather than constantly doing for others. The liberated person discovers that their worth is not their usefulness, their value is not their function, their love is not their service. Perhaps most challenging is developing what Jung called differentiated love, the ability to care for others without taking responsibility for their healing, to feel compassion without feeling compelled to fix, to offer presence without sacrificing yourself. This love recognizes that the highest service you can provide is not your endless availability, but your authentic presence, not your constant help, but your conscious example of someone who has done their own work. The sacred turn inward reveals what I call the authentic healer within, not the compulsive helper who needs others to be broken, but the wise guide who has traveled the territory of their own healing and can therefore offer genuine assistance to others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. This authentic healer helps when helping serves both parties, refuses when helping would harm either party, and maintains the capacity to distinguish between genuine service and psychological addiction. This transformation also requires embracing what Jung called creative selfishness, the willingness to prioritize your own growth, to focus on your own healing, to invest in your own development with the same passion you once brought to others' problems. This selfishness is not cruel but sacred, not narcissistic but necessary, not abandonment of others but the foundation for authentic service that comes from abundance rather than depletion. The death of the false helper gives birth to what I call the sovereign human, someone who has faced their own shadows, healed their own wounds, lived their own life so fully that they no longer need others' brokenness to feel whole, others' neediness to feel important, others' dependence to feel valuable. This sovereign human can love without rescuing, care without controlling, serve without sacrificing, because they have learned the fundamental truth that Jung spent his lifetime teaching. You can only give to others what you have given to yourself. You can only heal others to the extent that you have healed yourself. You can only love others as deeply as you have learned to love the totality of who you are. The sacred turn inward is not abandonment of others, but the beginning of authentic service, not the end of healing, but its proper beginning, Not selfishness, but the foundation of selfless love that flows from wholeness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from the deep well of your own healed humanity rather than the shallow puddle of your unhealed need to be needed. Stop trying to heal them. Start healing yourself. The world doesn't need another compulsive helper. It needs you to become so whole, so healed, so authentically yourself that your very presence becomes an invitation for others to do the same work you have finally had the courage to do. If you recognize yourself in this pattern of compulsive healing, if you see how your endless focus on others has been your way of avoiding yourself, then your transformation begins with the most radical act you can commit. Stop helping others for 1 week. Not because you want to be cruel, but because you want to be real. Not because you want to abandon others, but because you want to finally meet yourself. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to do the terrifying, necessary work of turning your healing attention inward toward the only person you can actually heal, yourself. Share this video with another compulsive helper who needs to understand that their endless giving is actually elaborate taking. Their constant healing is sophisticated hiding. Their perpetual service is systematic self-avoidance. And most importantly, start today. Identify one person you've been trying to heal, fix, or save. Stop. Withdraw your healing projections. Turn that analytical attention inward and ask, what am I trying to heal in them that I refuse to heal in myself? What wound am I treating in others that I won't acknowledge in my own psyche? What am I avoiding about my own life by staying so busy with theirs? Your healing is waiting. Your own wounds need your attention. Your authentic life is calling from beneath the pile of others' problems you've been using to bury it. The people who truly love you don't need you to heal them. They need you to heal yourself so you can love them from wholeness instead of woundedness, from choice instead of compulsion, from your authentic self instead of your helper persona. Stop being needed and start being real. Stop fixing others and start facing yourself. Stop avoiding your own healing by getting lost in everyone else's. You are not their savior. You are your own unfinished business. Get to work.